Good evening, everyone. I am Thulani, and I am a trainer and with Roots of Justice, and I also work with another organization called Wider Stand. I do anti-racism analysis trainings. I'm at my house, even though it looks like I'm out in the woods. I'm at my house. My wife and daughter are here. My daughter, this was her last day of school. Well, yeah, it was yesterday, was my wife's last day of work. So they are here. I didn't have a secret room to go to. so we are here. They usually, when they know that I'm doing stuff, they usually try to, but I got a green screen back here so that they can walk around and do what they need to do. But just so y'all know, I ain't in the woods. And if you hear some noises that sound like we're in my house, you'll know that we're in my house. We are talking tonight about Christianity. And specifically, we're going to be talking about Christianity without racism. And with me tonight is Dr. Calenthia Dowdy. She's also a trainer with Roots of Justice. She'll say more about herself. Bethany Stewart is with me tonight, and Dr. Nathan Pederson is with me also. And we are really looking forward to hear from everybody on this. You'll have an opportunity to post some questions as you're listening, because this is one of those things that when you hear it, I'm sure that it sounds weird. Christianity without racism. Okay, did y'all hear that? Okay, sorry. So yeah, when you clicked on that, Christianity without racism, I'm sure you were a little bit curious. So we're going to try to feed your curiosity tonight, and I think that you're going to actually leave with some new questions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Calenthia Dowdy, and she's going to begin our discussion tonight. She's going to say something about who she is and what she does, and she's going to say something about the subject matter, Christianity without racism.
All right. Thank you, Conrad. Hey, everybody. I am Calenthia Dowdy. And always good to take part in these Facebook Lives. And I want to add, like Conrad, at least when my mic is live, I am also in my home, and I have a dog who likes to play at night, or at least after 5 p.m., likes to play, likes to bug me, and likes to bark a lot. So hopefully that won't pick up. But good to be here. I am also a facilitator with Roots of Justice. I've been with the team for about 20 years, I think exactly 20 years. I'm also a cultural anthropologist by training and a faith worker and anti-racism facilitator by practice. I grew up attending all Black schools, Black public schools in Philadelphia, except for that one time when I was in about 5th grade where they were doing a busing project, during the 1970s and trying to integrate schools. And I was bused to a school in another neighborhood where there were white kids and a few Asian kids and Black kids. But outside of that, all my schooling through 12th grade was in Black schools in the city of Philadelphia. I also grew up in all Black churches, Black Baptist churches. And, I think at one time I probably scorned those spaces a little bit, but looking back, as an older person looking back, those are spaces where I felt 100% seen and nurtured. And I have great respect for the work that was done in those Black churches and in those Black public schools as well, because I can't remember other times where I felt as seen and as nurtured. My adult life has been spent primarily in white dominant spaces, whether it was college, seminary, graduate school, and certainly in my places of employment. I've spent the last 25 years teaching. I've been on the faculty of 2 different predominantly white Christian colleges, or PWIs as they are called, predominantly white institutions. And I have stories. I won't share all that right now, but I certainly have stories from those experiences. But I'll say for now, it was in those white Christian spaces, those holy spaces, as an adult, where I began to experience not being seen, certainly not being nurtured. And I began to experience stress and turmoil. Certainly, as I am aging, I am more aware of that turmoil. Youth brings a lots of resilience with it. So it was in those white Christian spaces as an adult that turmoil began to set in, and where I eventually began to ask myself two questions, actually lots of questions, but two questions. One, is this Christianity? Is this Christianity in those predominantly white institutions? Is this what it's supposed to be like and feel like? And then usually my answer was no. My answer was often no. And then my second question was, I wonder what Christianity is really supposed to look like, because I just don't believe that this is it. So that's my long introduction, but that's a little bit about who I am. Thanks.
Interesting that you use the words seen and not seen. That was really interesting. Dr. Anthea Butler has written a book called Evangelical Christian Racism, and in that book she has an anecdote about that same kind of situation where she is a member of a congregation and has been a member of this congregation for some time, and then there's some incident that causes people to want to meet with Black people now, because it was a predominantly white congregation, but with a sprinkling of, and it was an evangelical congregation anyway. So they invited these people from a Black church. So during the service, Dr. Butler is sitting beside the pastor's mother. And the pastor's mother turns to her and welcomes her as a visitor to the church that she's been a member of for quite some time. And she felt that same sense of, wow, and do these people see me? Thanks for sharing that, Calenthia. And Bethany. So during this time, here's what we talked about doing. So none of this is going to work like we talked about. So we talked about, everybody taking a chance to say something. We introduced themselves, and then we're going to talk, ask one another questions. So we're still going to try to do that and make it seem nice and workable, but it's not going to work out like we planned it on paper. But still, you're still going to get a good
Conrad,
some good information. Yeah, you're going to get some good information. So Bethany.
Hey, y'all. So my name is Bethany Stewart. As I was introduced earlier, I use she, her pronouns, and I consider myself to be a social justice creative. And what that means is I work to connect the creative arts to broader social justice movements so people can see the fullness of their humanity expressed in those events, right? And I live in Philadelphia, and I've been striving to make the connections between radical Jesus following and radical subversion of American white supremacy for some years now. And yeah, it's beating me up, but I keep on going and keep on being a part of this collective and getting my strength from that. I attended the historically Black Delaware State University. I also had the opportunity so let me take a break. I also am at home, and there is a dog 2 yards over that is so loud, and you all may hear him pick up on my mic at some points throughout the night. But with that, I attended Delaware State University. And while there, I had the opportunity to join my sorority, Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated, which continues to give me the opportunity to be in spaces where I get to love other Black women. What else about me? I've been a part of the same church for some years now. And within this church, I've had the opportunity to co-lead the Circle Mobilizing Because Black Lives Matter team, which is a compassion team at Circle of Hope Church. I was a really active community organizer in Philadelphia, serving as a core organizer for the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund, the Philadelphia Participatory Defense Hub Initiative, as well as Black Lives Matter Philly. And I've also worked in nonprofit leadership for some years now, about on and off for about 10 years or 12 years now. And presently, I'm working as a training and partnership development for coordinator for a girls serving nonprofit. And I formerly worked as an employment specialist with formerly homeless youth. And then lastly, I serve as 1/3 of the Color Correction podcast trio, which is one of my favorite projects that I do. I'm always doing something, but I really like this one. And this podcast is about race and faith from the perspective of a Black girl, an Asian guy, and a white guy too. And I added this at the last minute as I heard Calenthia talking about her church background, but my church background is really diverse. I typically, I just don't have an understanding of denominations, right? I understand the history behind denominations, but it's always felt so weird to me that churches were separated. I can remember as a kid, the first time my mom talked to me about denominations, and I was like, what? Aren't we all just Christians? So typically, communities in which I feel connected to people is where I'm drawn. So the church I grew up going to was non-denominational. I had a brief stint in a Presbyterian church. Then we went to a Methodist church for some years. And I went ahead now in my adult years and I've settled in with the Anabaptists. So that's me.
Thanks, Bethany. I think Jesus actually would be puzzled by denominations also. Because I'm thinking that was not the vision, but what do I know? Dr. Nathan.
Thanks, Thulani. I'm glad to be here on this panel. My name is Nathan Pederson. I grew up in white evangelicalism, so definitely a little bit of a different experience, which I tell people I didn't realize, and I didn't realize I was white. I didn't realize I grew up in white evangelicalism until deep into my journey, just because it was the norm. It was the thing that I lived and breathed, and it was the Christianity that I knew, and the kind of evangelicalism that I grew up in was somewhat fundamentalist. So it's kind of like, if you don't believe this particular way, maybe you're not even really a Christian. And I didn't realize at the time how much race had to do with so much of that. My family was basically a part of like Baptistic and non-denominational churches, and eventually the Christian Missionary Alliance. I went to school to be a pastor because that's what I wanted to do. And then I went to seminary at Trinity Divinity School in Chicagoland. And at that time, I was, for different reasons, beginning to experience a number of different transformations in life. And one of them was I met my now wife, Ederonke Bampoje, and she's Yoruba, and I was in love with her at first sight, and I totally did not understand what it could possibly mean to enter into an interracial relationship. I don't know if I do yet understand all the dynamics of that. It's this journey, but for me, it was a slow learning process at that point about what it meant to be white, and especially when we started having children. And that was around, specifically, we had our first son around the time when Trayvon Martin was murdered. It was just this process of beginning to understand my own whiteness and what that meant in terms of not just my marriage, but also my calling, being in seminary at the time. So yeah, I began to kind of inhabit an intellectual trajectory just because of who I am. And so I went to grad school and eventually ended up doing a PhD at Loyola University, Chicago. And my dissertation work is in basically what whiteness is as a lived experience, and how theology historically and now has been so instrumental in weaving the web of whiteness. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. This wrestling with race and Christianity is both an intellectual journey for me, just because of I feel like what God has called me to do, but also having a pastoral background and being in the church, being in the white church, and then realizing it's the white church. There's also these pastoral dimensions. I work with Wider Stand Consulting as logistics coordinator, so that's how I know Thulani. So we work with different clients on their journeys in anti-racism. I teach in the university too about this intersection of religion and race. I was teaching at Fordham this past year, and so my classes focused on this, and many of the students were at first very confused how we could do a whole theology class around this question of whiteness and coloniality. But I think for many of them it was rewarding and challenging, and I hope transformational for them. So in many different ways, this is a personal journey of understanding for me and trying to help others, but especially white people along in that journey too.
Wow. One of the reasons that I thought of you when we first began talking about and thinking about Christianity without racism is because of, you and I had a couple of drive-by conversations, and you mentioned that you were doing this work, in the intersection of race and religion. And I said, ooh, let's hear from him. So let's hear from you. Say more about your work and your research.
Yeah, happy to. And we were talking earlier, and Dr. Calenthia was saying she's not long-winded. I am. So I'm gonna work on being trying to be as concise as possible, and then I look forward to our conversation, everything. Yeah, and I guess what I'll say at first is that a lot of my thought comes out of what evangelicalism I feel like has become with January 6th and the rise of Christian nationalism. So, right, I just share some of my personal journey is wrestling with that. And intellectually, it became the question of why is it so difficult for Christianity, specifically in this case, evangelical Christianity? Why is it so difficult for Christianity to recognize the enmeshment in racial logics and whiteness, A, and B, why then is it so difficult for it to envision itself without racism, as we're trying to do today? And part of my argument in my work is that this has to do with the complexity of what racism is. And I know, Thulani, I imagine you are going to articulate some of that too, your thoughts on it. For me, race is something fundamentally, racial logics are fundamentally worked out like under the surface. They're worked out underneath people's desires and consciousness at the level of stories and myths that we live by. And so we often think about racism as something we should be able to articulate. And I think people are confused when maybe people who think more critically about race try to get us to imagine how it's something more under the surface. So that's what I focus on, and then for Christianity, it becomes a question of historically and in the now. is it the case that Christianity, when it tries to, whatever language we want to use, when it tries to make disciples, or when it tries to envision who Jesus is and what it means to look and live like Jesus, is there a racial idea in mind? And I mean, I'm convinced more and more there is. And the question is, why is it so difficult to see that for, for Christianity, and especially white evangelicalism, to see that and reckon with it and begin to deconstruct it, like we're trying to talk about today, what it might look like on the other side of that. So I just want to talk for a couple minutes about kind of historically what Christianity has done with race. And I mean, the first piece of the puzzle is, as I just mentioned, that race, became this historical biological claim of fundamental difference, this claim of separating out people, claiming that through, like, this bodily mark or this visible appearance, people are fundamentally different. But we obviously know race is not a biological reality. It's a social construct. I think what I always insist on in my work, and what I hear from decolonial and Black critical scholars, is yes, race is a social construct, but that doesn't mean that it's something we can wish away or we can just ignore. So race is a social construct that has material effects in the world. It's shaped the world in material and concrete ways. And so we have to deal with that. So that's kind of the basis out of which I do my work. And how I then explore the ways in which whiteness is involved in that, of being this kind of force underneath the surface, this symbolic force underneath the surface that is yet shaping the world, is by thinking about how Christianity has thought about, Blackness or darkness and whiteness and light in these yes, symbolic, but I might use the language like moral or spiritual meanings, right? So I want to talk about that a little bit, but I keep using this word whiteness, and maybe as a panel we'll keep using it. I've always liked Willie Jennings. He's a theologian. I like what he says about whiteness, and I'm just gonna say what he says about whiteness, and more or less this is kind of what I mean when I say whiteness. He says his use of the term whiteness does not refer to people of European descent, but to a way of being in the world and seeing the world that forms cognitive and affective structures able to seduce people into its habituation and its meaning making. I think it's so hard for people to think about race as something that, yes, it has to do about skin on one level, but on the deeper level, it has to do with the meanings that have been given to skin, apparently, and then all the work that has gone underneath that meaning-making process in terms of creating whole cultures and stories and mythologies, and maybe even in the case of Christianity, whole religious frameworks that say something about white skin or Black skin. So in my work, just briefly, I talk about how in the earliest phases of Christianity, when some of the desert monks were trying to work out the Christianity in the year 100 and 200, they give an accounts of the devil showing up to them sometimes. And it's most always the case, scholars tell us, that when the devil shows up in bodily form to these monks, it's a Black-skinned body. And this was tapping into ideas of the Ethiopian at the time, which the Roman Greco world thought about the Ethiopian in these proto-racial, or these, maybe not pre-racial terms, but there's all this prejudice involved. And so the monks begin to visualize the other, the foreign other, maybe even the demonic other, as this non-white body. And that never leaves Christianity, and it gets worked out in different ways. The last kind of what I focus on, especially in my work, is at the in the like 14 and 1500s, when Christianity is beginning to discovering itself as this colonial imperial power. It's not just about the monk in the desert. It's about, how is Christian philosophy understanding light and darkness? And this rubric begins to be created where, light and man and white and reason is on one side, and darkness and female and blackness and the body is on the other side. And the whole idea in Christianity, and eventually this becomes the case in Western philosophy with somebody like Kant, is this idea that what it looks like to be human and to be reasoner and to pursue the good is to move towards the light, to move towards maleness, to move towards reason and away from your body and away from your emotions. And that's where racial logic comes from. And so that's why race is so difficult to untangle and to reckon with, because it's involved in all these symbolic and philosophical processes that are, not only thousands of years old, but they're deep in our bodies in ways we don't even realize. So I kind of envision myself as kind of, just because of where my expertise lies and the fact that I am white, is at least in this segment bringing kind of a diagnostic maybe that hopefully is helpful and fruitful. And I have more to say about how we kind of move away from that, some ideas I've had and how that's, played out. But that's kind of my take and a reflection of my academic work, and hopefully, Thulani, some of our conversations about, why whiteness and race is so difficult for Christianity to reckon with.
Can I jump in? Okay, I'm gonna read your lips, Conrad.
Yeah, go.
So that was Dr. Pederson. Thank you. That was wonderful, particularly I think philosophical explanation. And I don't know. I mean, you pulled a similar quote that I was going to highlight when it comes to what whiteness is. I don't know who's quoting who. If Jennings is quoting De La Torre, or De La Torre is quoting Miguel, or is quoting Jennings. But similarly, he writes in his book, Burying White Privilege, Resurrecting a Badass Christianity. When speaking of whiteness, he's clear that he's talking about what he calls ontological whiteness, which has more to do with a particular worldview, like you were just saying, a particular way of being, a way of thinking and reasoning morally, than it does to skin color. And I highlight this because this means that anybody, this was a hard one for me to kind of grasp, even folks of color who embrace this ontological whiteness can be considered white, right? I mean, they're certainly not getting all the benefits and privileges of whiteness, but there are folks of color who also embrace this, right? Because it's a worldview, it's a way of thinking. De La Torre says, anyone or any group or institution who buys into this particular worldview or way of thinking and being in the world is white. So that's one piece, right? So thinking about whiteness in more of a philosophical way and thinking of it as, I think you used the word seduction, right? And for some people, it certainly can be very seductive. I don't know if it's as difficult, frankly, for many people to see the entanglement of racism and Christianity. It just depends on where you stand, right? Where your social location is. Certainly as a Black woman moving through the world, the scales were just falling off before I even got any kind of anti-racism analysis, right? That I began to realize, okay, there's something happening here, right? Where people, these good Christian people, in this sense, they also were white-skinned people, had something. It was as if it was something being held over me, me, and there's something that was kind of pulling me back into this space of having to agree, because I also identified as Christian, right? So they had all the power in defining what Christianity was. And as I grew and the scales began to fall, I began to think something's not right here, right? So I just want to toss that out there. It's not as hard for everybody to see. And I tell you, you talk to some of these younger folks out here, they see it with the quickness. That is racist. I'm not with Christianity because it is clearly racist. I read years ago, probably in my 20s, I don't know, I read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, written in 1845. Douglass wrote, and this struck me, he wrote that he was not opposed to all religion, only the Christianity of slaveholding America. He wrote, and you probably know this quote, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look at it as the climax of all misnomers, the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels." Douglass is boldly calling Christianity of this land a fraud. It is a fraud. And I love the first piece because he gives us a glimpse, right? Because I think in our time together, we're supposed to try to imagine what a Christianity without racism would look like. And that beginning of that quote, I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ, and therefore hates all these other things. I love the term slaveholder Christianity, which is used amongst a lot of folks who just aren't buying into what we've come to understand as Christianity. For them, it's like, no, that is slaveholder Christianity. It's not the Christianity of Christ. So those are just some of my thoughts coming out of what you were talking about, Dr. Pederson.
Thanks.
Can I jump in and add some thoughts?
Yeah, please do, Bethany, go.
Yeah. Dr. Pederson, I really appreciated what you said towards the end about how racism exists beyond the philosophical, but also rests within our bodies as well, that we experience this racism in our body, both as people of color and as white people, right? The many generations of racialized trauma that is passed down to people of color, and also the many generations of racism that are passed down to white people. And I often start any training session that I'm having or anti-racism consulting sessions with body work, because it's so important to start reconnecting to your body. Simply because white supremacy robs us of our humanity, and to start by recognizing the fullness of your humanity by doing body work, by stretching a little bit, by breathing deeply, right? That starts to move something within us. And I think it's, I think really focusing on how racism rests within our bodies is super crucial. And I think white people will start dancing better, right? I really think that racism is locked up in y'all. That's what throws off the rhythm, right? That's what my theory is.
So you said the rhythm throws off the rhythm. Yeah.
I really, Thulani, I don't know if I'm supposed to talk now, but
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I appreciate absolutely both what you said. Bethany, what you just said right now about racism being in the body. I mean, in part, that's there's a whole intellectual process of understanding that's the case, and then there's also this personal and affective journey, right? And if people like Jennings or Frederick Douglass is right that that this is about, cognitive and affective. I catch myself sometimes recognizing I'm doing something out of my whiteness, and recognizing, how deep that is in me, like it's my inclination to do this or to do that, because it's the way I've always done it. It's like body memory. And even if you don't practice something for a long time, some like an instrument, like your fingers can still know and remember really easily. I think so. That's really insightful. I think racism is in our bodies like that. And for white people, that's part of the journey, is not just recognizing that, but then trying to like rewire not just your mind, but also like re-engage your body in completely different ways.
If we have a spot for a break, we've used the term racism a number of times. So for those of us who do this work often, we understand what we mean when we say racism. But for the purposes of our gathering tonight, I want to share with you what we mean when we say racism. I'm going to try to pull up I'm going to try to do a PowerPoint, and I'm going to try to share my screen. And y'all are going to let me know if it's working. Is it working? So here's how we define it. I work with an organization called Roots of Justice, as you can see the sign over there. And I also work with Widerstand. But as an anti-racism educator, when we do these trainings, we have to define terms, because what do you mean? So we're going to take a minute to do that. So racism, obviously we're talking about race. And so Dr. Pederson already gave us a pretty good explanation of what we mean when we're talking about race. But what we share in the training very often is we ask people how do you define a person's race? How do you decide what a person's race is? And what we come away with over the years of doing this is realizing that the ways that we determine a person's race is flawed, because very often it's by what we see and what we hear. In the trainings, we hear that you can determine a person's race by the music they listen to, or by the religion they belong to, or by the color of their skin, or the color of their hair, or the texture of their hair, or the color of their eyes, or their body shape, the music they listen to. And so we hear all of those things as a way of that we use as ways of determining a person's race, and all of them are flawed, because clearly people who are from different ethnicities or from different races, if you will, can share the same religion, or can share the same music, or can have a similar body type, or can have similar textures of hair. So the ways that we determine a person's race are flawed, but nevertheless, they're real for us, because it makes it easy for us when we just look at one another, we kind of decide what that person's race is. And once that happens, we get to the next part. It tells us what kind of interaction we're going to have with that person because of prejudice. We all have it. So we prejudge. So when we encounter a person, we take a look at them, or we take a listen to them, we decide what race they are, and then we decide how this interaction is going to go. Even if we don't do that verbally, it's a mental gymnastics that we do, that we decide how the encounter is going to go. And again, prejudice is not unique. We all have it of some kind, but in this context, we're talking specifically about race prejudice, the prejudging of someone based solely on race. So there's a plus. The other thing about prejudice, too often people think they use the word racism and prejudice as though they're the same thing, but they're not, because prejudice is an individual. It's an individual issue, and so, but to put the ism on it, it requires something else. So, personal prejudice or individual prejudice is not the same as racism. What it requires in order for it to become an ism is it requires power. Prejudice, race prejudice plus power. the power to impact the lives of the people who I'm prejudiced against. So individual prejudice is not racism. Race prejudice plus power is where we get the ism on the end of race. And it's not just power, because power by itself is not a bad thing. It's just not. And for those of us who identify as Christians, there's something that the Bible says about that. You know, because Pentecost is coming up soon, and the scripture goes that when the Spirit comes on you, you will have power, and so power itself is not a bad thing. It is when power is abused. So we're talking about race prejudice plus the systemic abuse of power. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and we're going to talk some about what we said we were going to talk about is Christianity without racism. So this is the definition that we use in the anti-racism analysis work that we do. Racism equals race prejudice plus power. Write that down. Remember that. If you go to an anti-racism training or something else and they're not using this definition, then they're not using the accepted definition that's used by anybody who's doing social justice work around race. Anywhere you go, if people are doing serious social justice work around the issues of race, this is the definition that we go with. It is not individual prejudice. It is the systemic abuse of power. So if anybody has any questions or comments about that, I don't expect any of my guests to have a question or a comment about that. I mean, a question about that. A comment, yeah.
So perfect. That is our definition. That is our shared and common definition and understanding of racism. And this is a question perhaps for all of us, or maybe what we're going to peel back throughout the rest of our time together. But defining what is Christianity is right. So we looked at racism. What is Christianity is a lot more complex, right? So we're clear on racism. What is Christianity? And what does that look like? The two clearly are enmeshed. But what does a Christianity without racism really look like?
Christianity is so embedded. I believe that racism is so embedded in the cultural DNA of Christianity that this actually could be phrased differently. It could, rather than saying Christianity without racism, we could be exploring what racism would be like without Christianity. Because I believe that what history has shown us is that Christianity is not complicit or complacent with white supremacist ideology, but is actually responsible. Especially if we go back to the time that Dr. Pederson was talking about, not even as far back as he was talking about, but just the 14th or 15th century when the church was the Catholic Church at that time, because again, we're talking about before the Reformation. So when the Catholic Church basically decided that any land that wasn't already occupied by Catholics, that the colonizer could consider it empty, you literally could nullify the existence of the people who lived there. So you technically discovered it. That's why when you ask your teacher, if there were people here when Columbus arrived, how can we say he discovered America? Either your teacher didn't know about the doctrine of discovery or wasn't allowed to tell you about the doctrine of discovery. But it was because of the doctrine of discovery and the role that the church played in establishing religious superiority. And because of that, when they moved on to these other papal bulls, like the Romanus Pontifex, where the church told Portugal that you could capture, vanquish, subdue, subjugate all pagans and enemies of Christ. So the church is assigning identity to anybody that's not Catholic, right? You're a pagan, enemy of Christ. And then he went on to say that you can render their persons to perpetual slavery. What I believe that was established there was, I believe that religious superiority, which down through the centuries, we see that religious superiority just morphed into white supremacy when whiteness became a thing. So religious superiority was the embryo for white supremacy. And so I believe that white supremacy is in the cultural DNA of Christianity. And because it's there, it is difficult to dislodge.
Mhm. I think this is a great question. I don't know if you all have seen this in the chat, but did you see that question, Dr. Pederson? The question is, can one be a person of European descent in the US and not be assimilated into whiteness, i.e. become white, not become white? And the person who's asking the question says, I am white.
Thanks, Calenthia.
Do you wanna give
It's
a
for you. It's for
It's
you.
for you.
I mean, so I think the interesting thing about the conversation we're trying to have today is that we could take the route of, for example, collapsing Christianity into whiteness, right? Or Frederick Douglass could have dismissed Christianity and not sought like a different Christianity, not sought the truth behind the fraud, or the true Jesus behind the slaveholders Jesus. And I say that to say that if whiteness is if we can use theological language, a sinful expression of, theoretically, of course, and I think Jesus comes to liberate us from whiteness. For me, personally and experientially, and just knowing the 1,000-year, the centuries and more that it took to weave the web of racism and whiteness, I am skeptical that any person with white skin can sustainably live a life in which they're able to constantly escape the privilege that whiteness affords them on a regular basis. And for me, it's maybe the better thing is that it's a pastoral response. If I think white people shouldn't necessarily be asking the question, can I be not white in the sense of some kind of like I'm finally free, but at this point in our history and in the church, because of how deep racism goes, it's my personal opinion that I think white people are in more of a mode of repentance, and that has to go so deep that I mean, people can disagree with me, but I'm skeptical that as a white man, I can ever, in this life, I'll be able to escape my whiteness in a significant way where I feel like I'm free from it. Because whether it's this body sense, or I forget, Bethany, the language you used, body work, whether it's your body memory, or whether it's the white people around you trying to seduce you back into it, or the devil himself. People can disagree, but I don't think so. And maybe it's even my whiteness with all the hesitation. Like, honestly, that it might be. But and I definitely have some other things to say, maybe near the end, about like practical things for white people. But just one of those things is just this posture of repentance. And yeah, I don't know, Calenthia or Bethany, if you want to push back, or
No, I'm not going to push back at all. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, me too.
But I think it's important too to talk here about, if we were to push the definition a little bit, to talk about systems, right? I mean, because this is bigger than individuals. Right. Certainly when we do our trainings, we're saying this is bigger than individual white people. And then when we talk ontological whiteness, that really is getting at a worldview. It's getting at systems. So yeah, I think an individual white dude can walk around and say, I'm not white, but this person is still benefiting from power, privilege, profit, You know, so yeah, no, I think you're right on with that. I agree. Yeah, but we have to also highlight systems. Yeah.
I don't want to lose the question that Calenthia asked, and and it sounded almost like she was asking it as a rhetorical question, but I think it's still a good question. So there was that question, how are we defining Christianity? There's that one. And the other thing I'd like to ask or challenge us on is we're using terms about each other that were handed to us by the colonizers, right? So I'm wondering if, as individuals, is there value in, for me, for example, I take the idea of being an African descendant seriously. I don't refer to myself as Black anymore because, excuse me, because the Portuguese called my ancestors Black cargo, cargo negro. And so when we got here, we got to be simply negro, and then we translated that to Black. So because of that, I think that if my ancestors stepped to me today and asked me what was I, if my ancestors were Bamaleki, or if they were Zulu, or if they were Hausa, or if they were Yoruba, and they wanted to know how I identify myself, and I said Black, they would not know. That would be meaningless. It would just be a meaningless identity, because it's the identity that the colonizer imposed on us. And so I think as African descendants, there's value in trying to do the work of finding out what it means to actually be African, and not believe the lie that our history started when our ancestors arrived here as hostages in 1619, right? So we're not just Black, because that makes us the only people on the planet trying to create an identity out of a few hundred years of bad history. Everybody else has thousands of years of culture and history. But I think the same thing is a problem for white people also, because that's the identity that colonialism imposed on y'all as well. So just as people of color should be or could be, there's value in us doing the individual work of connecting with what it means to no longer be Black. I'm wondering if there's value for white people in personal value, because I agree that you can't control white privilege. But is there personal or individual value in trying to seek to be more than that, to be more than just white?
Yeah, I would just say, yeah, whiteness is this racial category. And sometimes white people want to think about race as just, other people, but whiteness is a racial category. And you're right. It's the historical process that white people also have been racialized as white. So absolutely, I agree.
All right, so how do we define Christianity?
When you initially ask the question, it feels really easy to me. So I'm interested in the complexity that you all are feeling, but I'm just like, yeah, people that follow Jesus Christ. That's what it feels like to me. And there's complexities and nuances that based on the denomination or the culture connected to Christianity, right? American Black folks compared to like church in Ghana or other African countries or in Europe, it's all going to be different. But my general sense, I'm like, that's easy. People that follow the Bible and the traditions of Jesus Christ.
White Jesus or Black Jesus?
That depends on your culture, doesn't it?
There is no white Jesus.
Hey, surprise.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I think it is simple, Beth. I agree. A few verses that always come to mind. If the Bible is a guide, and I believe it is a guide. I'm certainly not a literalist, but I do think it's It's a guide. So if the Holy Book is to be a guide, I think there are very few clear indicators of what Christianity is or what Christianity looks like. I love Micah 6:8. God requires that we act justly, love faithfulness, walk with humility. I love Matthew. So what's probably in all the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind. Love your neighbor just like you love yourself. Love your neighbor just like you love yourself. And I think of Matthew 25, right? That whole it's a lot in Matthew 25, but um, feeding the hungry, offering water to those who need water, bringing justice to folks who for whatever reason, race, gender, sexuality, those folks who have been marginalized in an unjust world, fighting and walking alongside of them for justice. So, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. I think those are very clear, practical pieces of what Christianity is supposed to look like. It is standing alongside those who have been called trash and treated as trash. And I fit many of those categories, those trash categories. And Jesus said, those are the people. You are the people who I care for, who I love, who mean more than you've been told that you mean. I think it's simple in that way.
I agree with you, Bethany and Calenthia, because I think the very people who Jesus got in trouble for sitting with are the same people who are most often not welcome in our churches, which says something about our churches, and the flavor of Christianity that we've historically begun to practice. I'm always intrigued at how denominations come about and how we get into this mode where we get to decide who's Christian and who's not. That's another dangerous one for me.
I think that's an interesting question, Thulani, if I can jump in here, because earlier you brought up Pentecost. And I mean, wait, that's this coming Sunday, right? On Pentecost Sunday. And, that's such a central story to Christianity. And at the heart of the Holy Spirit and the Pentecost event, both as the Spirit comes for the disciples of Jesus who are Jewish, but then especially as the Spirit then comes, to Cornelius later in Acts, to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people who weren't supposed to be in God's family. Pentecost becomes the story of Pentecost becomes how the Spirit of God and the gospel or the good news, the message of God's love, conquers all these different boundaries that had been drawn around who belongs in and who's out, and even before it's the Gentiles, the non-Jews, it's a eunuch. So, people who were marginalized sexually, which is interesting. And so that's certainly at the heart of Christianity, is this movement of God's work. And you said even the people who Jesus hung around with, kind of like what got him in trouble. So Christianity is not on the side of power, of like imperial power. It's for the marginalized, as Calenthia, as you and Bethany were saying too. So Pentecost and the work of the Spirit, I think, is something really crucial to consider here.
I wanted to go back and provide a clarification, but we have moved so quickly beyond it because of our expertise that it almost feels weird that I'm going back. But I wanted to say when I said it depends on your culture, I'm aware that there's no white Jesus, but oftentimes white people don't realize how much culture influences the way they practice Christianity, and it steers them to a white Jesus, but they would never explicitly say, my Jesus is white, but everything that they do, the way that they organize, even the people of color that are amongst their congregations, they're really steering them towards whiteness. So that's why I said it depends on your culture.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. I knew what you meant, but
Yeah,
thanks for
so did I.
clarifying it for the.
Yeah, this is going to be documented. So I was like, let me make sure I go back and clarify that.
Question from the chat. Oh, this one's for me. So how do we get from what has been described? Oh, it's not necessarily for me. Okay. So how do we get from what has been described by Dr. Calenthia to a tool of white supremacy?
I don't understand the context. Do we know?
How did this happen? So
How do we get from
Here, let me read it.
Christianity to a tool of
Right.
white supremacy?
It would seem impossible for the religion that Dr. Dowdy described to become a tool of white supremacy, actually was the comment.
Okay.
Pretty wild, isn't it?
I wrote myself a note and I said that everything is better with context, right? Like, when somebody, especially somebody's sense of humor, right? Like I think of myself, to know my background, to know my sense of humor makes things a little bit better, right? The same as with Jesus, right? Understanding Jesus, and in my faith background, it's kind of frowned upon to go to seminary or to really question things too much, right? To get the history behind it. And I think a lot of other folks have grown up with that same experience, right? It's not about the history, right? It's about the way Jesus makes you feel. It's all about the feelings, right? But when we understand Jesus in historical context, I think that's what keeps the authenticity and the genuineness of a Christ that experienced marginalization and experienced oppression, right? That Jesus being highlighted, that context is so crucial to keeping Christianity from being a tool of white supremacy. But so much of so much of the history, so much of the context is really frowned upon. People really frown upon knowing the context of Jesus, and that's really important. I think of particularly, I can't remember what the class was called, but it was led by Dr. Naomi Washington Lakehart. And she's an incredible professor, religion professor. She works for the city of Philadelphia. I'm a super fangirl of Naomi and her theology. But I'll never forget in one class, her talking about how at the time that Jesus was living that, and I've talked about this several times, maybe amongst Roots of Justice as well, but at the time that Jesus was growing up, that he lived in a Roman soldier occupied land, right? And she said, she has this beautiful voice, but she said, you know, what if Mary had to have the same conversation with Jesus that we have to have with our children and our Black sons about the police? And I just remember feeling like a shock, like go through my body, like, oh, Jesus is mine. Like Jesus knows my experience so personally, right? Jesus knows people who have experienced violence from the police so personally. This Jesus is mine, right? Like knowing that context is so important. I got really passionate.
All right.
Yeah, we like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the question is good. I was reading it historically, I guess, and thinking maybe the question was, how did we get from this pure, peaceable Christianity to what we have now? Like, what happened? What went wrong? Let's see. Sounds like we're talking about an ideal version of Christianity. Okay, is this continuing the question?
Yeah, could you read it, Calenthia?
Okay, sure. Along similar lines, it sounds like we're talking an ideal version of Christianity. What about people who use the Bible to justify things like prosperity gospel and others who call themselves Christian, even if they don't meet what others might say is Christian? And if we don't, what does that do to how we consider trying to create or dream of or identify Christianity without racism? Wow, that's chock packed. Prosperity gospel and how others might call themselves Christian, but some of us others folks might say, you don't meet my definition of Christian. All the problems. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. Somebody want to tackle that?
Oh, man, my camera and my lighting is just acting up. Sorry about that, everyone.
Yeah, you're a little pixely too. Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know how to fix it. Don't know how to fix it.
What does that do to how we consider trying to create or dream of or identify Christianity without racism? It's big, isn't it?
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
well, I was thinking about some of the tenets, some of the things that we named as because we named, Bethany simply said following Jesus, and then we talked a little bit about the kind of people that Jesus got in trouble for being with, the tax collectors and sex workers and so forth. And it almost sounds like if we're expecting to see Christianity without racism, that we're actually talking about developing another denomination where the focus now is on those things that we just talked about, inclusivity and all of that stuff. But it sounds like another denomination could grow out of that because the church is so fractured. I think to envision Christianity without racism almost requires another faction, or it almost requires another denomination or something.
Or does it require just throwing it out? Just throwing it out. We don't have to throw away Jesus, but does it require throwing it out? Like, I entertain that question when folks say, should we just get rid of the Christianity, and quite frankly, a whole bunch of other religions too. But should we get rid of Christianity? I entertain that. I do.
Mhm.
Yeah, me
Because
too.
this thing that we're practicing doesn't seem to be it.
Right,
Right? It's not it.
right.
Does it
And
feel
do we
too
want to
tainted?
start another thing? No, but what I do like, I love when I see folks who are choosing to live in community. And I don't necessarily mean living with each other, sharing a house or any of that. But there are blocks of people who have decided they're going to live their lives in this kind of way together. People who agree to this, they're going to live their lives as lives of sharing, of looking out for one another, of trying to act justly toward one another. And maybe there's small experiments, maybe they're community experiments, but people are attempting to exist and breathe and move in something that is different, right? Different, but it's there. Like, it's not so different that we can't conceive of it. But what does it mean to really live out the principles of Jesus in
Mhm.
this way that removes all of this other philosophical garbage?
I think you
Do
just
you-
named it, Calenthia, because I agree with you. I think Christianity without racism happens in small community.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mhm.
Go ahead, Bethany. I'm sorry.
I was going to ask, do you think that Christianity is irredeemable at this point, that it's just been so tainted that there's really no process of doing the work to redeem this? It's about starting over. Is that what you're thinking?
I think the
Dreaming up something
institution,
new?
I think the institution is irredeemable. I do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We look at politics. Once Donald Trump got into office, and the majority of the people who put him there were white evangelicals, that just was very telling to me.
Yeah.
Me
It's
too.
like
Mhm,
we're
absolutely.
on way, we're not even on different pages, we're in different books, right? We're in totally different books. Um,
I
People
saw
who I
that
know
hypocrisy.
personally,
Yeah.
I didn't get it.
Yeah.
I didn't get it.
Yeah, and I love what you guys have said about experimentalism and small communities. I'm I think behind this question, not necessarily with the asker, but in general behind this kind of question is kind of the danger of idealism and the danger of purity, right? So
Mhm.
the danger of idealism is thinking that um, if we're going to imagine a different Christianity, it has to be this global, like it has to be perfect, almost, but also global and for everybody and all over the world at the same time for it to be like working. And then with the idol of perfection or purity along similar lines, but just this notion that, well, if we're not going to get it completely right, like why even try? So I like this idea of experimentalism in small communities about like valuing ambiguity and discomfort and doing things maybe in a partial way. um I think especially for white people, it's going to be the way forward is going to be full of mistakes and stumbles and needing to be called out and realizing that, well, you've done better, but like as I've like 2 or 3 or 5 years ago, like I look back and I thought I was on the path and now I realize, oh, like I really wasn't. And probably 5 years from now, I'm going to look back on this time and realize it's the same thing.
Mhm.
And so the enemy, I know it's an adage, right? The enemy of progress is perfection. Is that how it goes? But I think with religion, we think that if religion is pure, like that religion has to be pure and perfect and universal. But that's the temptation of empire. That's like the temptation of colonial Christianity.
Yeah.
But that's a temptation that then small communities can begin to resist. And then the other thing that goes along with that, I was thinking, Dr. Calenthia, something you said is, well, no, Bethany, you brought up the institution. And I think Christianity has been always full of reform, whether we call it the Reformation or whether it's something that happens in the Catholic Church itself, like Vatican II, or whether it's more contemporary, like, the charismatic renewal movement. Christianity is always renewing itself and going back to its inner spirit and its core. And sometimes that involves, doing away with the institution. Even though in the moment it's so difficult to imagine a different kind of Christianity, Christians have always done it throughout history. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm a big fan of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German guy.
Mm.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book Life Together
Yeah.
talks about that temptation for perfection.
Oh, you're
Matter of
right.
fact, he says he says it's ungodly.
Yeah.
It's evil. Right? Remember that? Remember that part?
Yeah.
I love it. And says that the real work and move of the spirit. And remember, I think he was writing that one in a context of an underground seminary or something like that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Kind of bouncing his ideas off of that experience of people who had similar beliefs, right? They believed in Jesus the Christ and so forth, being together and living together, eating together, studying together, the whole thing, and talking about how sometimes there are disagreements, sometimes there are, arguments, whatever, and that's all right, right? That is the move of God. As long as we agree to be together in those moments, we're human. It's going to be a little sloppy sometimes. He talks about perfectionism as if it's the Antichrist. It's fascinating. That read that little book, Life Together. I think there might be something in there for us as we think about what this Christianity without racism could look like. yeah, do we have ultimate answers? So folks who are out there listening, no, we're processing and thinking about this aloud and welcoming you to join us as we think about and imagine what Christianity without racism could look like. It's possible, and it won't be perfect. Yeah.
I'm hoping also that whoever's, this has raised new questions for me. And I think that, well, I hope that that's what's going on in everybody else's head too, that it's just raising new questions. And that that are not necessarily going to be answered here, but questions that we need to process. Stuff that
The
we need to
richness
process.
is in the question.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions out there, tech person?
I just looked and I don't see any.
Okay, I guess
Yeah.
not.
Neither
Looked at
me.
the Facebook Live.
So let's wrap it up then. Any closing remarks that can that can land on a hopeful note from you?
I am hopeful, you know. I'm an older lady now. I'll just say that. I'm an elder. That's so funny. And I am hopeful as it's always young people for me, you know, and as I listen to young folks talk about the faith and some of their hopes and their dreams, as long as they're not mimicking us, there's going to be some mimicking. And when I'm not rolling my eyes up in my head, because once in a while I might do that, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we are getting closer to what God wanted this thing to really look like. So yeah, I remain hopeful. I remain hopeful.
Thought that I have, again, starts with how racism and white supremacy robs all of us, people of color and white people, of their humanity. And yeah, I just want to encourage folks to be kind to themselves, right? That perfectionism is really rooted in a lot of unkindness. Change takes time, change takes being kind to oneself. And that kindness can really be a catalyst to get it together with white supremacy, right? Recognizing that you're not just stuck, that you're not stagnant, that you can have a growth mindset and move towards anti-racism every single day as a practice, as opposed to ever thinking that it's a destination. Anti-racism is not a destination, it's a daily practice. So be kind to yourself in your daily practice.
And I know there's a comment in the chat about talking about, you know, practical steps. I did kind of want to go there a little bit, like as a white person. I imagine there's other white people listening. I think the biggest thing for me is, and I actually didn't, I forgot to mention, my wife and I lead a growing like community-based organization. We basically bring white and black people together, and we just have honest conversations. And one of the earliest conversations, this was right after the murder of George Floyd, a black individual in the group said that what they're looking for out of white people is to stay, because oftentimes white people leave the conversation or don't do all the work, because it's easy for white people to walk away from the work because they think it's not about them. But Bethany, I appreciated what you just said, that white supremacy is an enemy to all of our humanity, obviously in different ways and historically that and on different registers exponentially, but for white people, it's also their own humanity is at stake too. And so learning the discipline of staying, even when that's uncomfortable, and hearing hard truths, and also the staying has to come into action too. So taking risks, sometimes losing relationships. I've lost close relationships. I mean, some of it had to do with Trump, and I know that's complex, but yeah, like taking anti-racism seriously for white people might involve like losing close relationships, and maybe not for everybody, but you know, whatever that might be, doing the work, but keeping at it forever because it is about all of us. That's the one practical kind of thing that I would leave with, which is not maybe super practical in some people's minds, but maybe especially for white people, they want a quick answer, but that's kind of the thing, that's my anchor right now practically, is just like, it can look like different things, but just listening and staying, even if I want to walk away from a conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate everything that's been said tonight. I am always struck by the passage in, well, two things. There's a lot of conversation about America becoming a Christian nation again. And I don't know whether I said this already, but I'm going to say it now. We already tried that, and it was called the Confederacy, and it worked out the way it worked out. But we tried that. The other thing that I think that's valuable to me is I think that in the book of Revelations, when John is there and he sees this multitude of people from every tribe, nation, people, and language, it is a visual. You know, he doesn't say that somebody told me there were people there from every tribe. He says, I looked and I saw. And what that says to me is that God is actually proud of God's creation and in the diversity of the creation. And so that in that sea of humanity, you know, in the afterlife, in that sea of humanity, it wasn't that everybody looked the same, because God is proud of God's creativity. So in that, I think I saw that God's vision for the church is that sea, that multitude. And even if it's a small multitude, even if it's these small groups that are multiracial, if we want to continue to use the word race, but have learned how to live in community and how to be ourselves within the communities that we live in, have permission to be ourselves, and permission to be multicultural, and not live under this desire, the culture of the colonizer having been established as the standard. We don't have to do that anymore. You know, all of these cultures and all of these cultural values are welcome in, and we just grow spiritually and follow Jesus. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be something? I'm loving all of y'all. Thanks everybody for coming tonight. And thanks for y'all out there who are watching. Hey, Roots of Justice actually works best when we get donations. So it gives us the capacity to do things. And we like doing things because we live in a world where things need to be done, especially on issues of race and racism. And I'm tooting our own horn, but Roots of Justice is one of the organizations in the United States who really does anti-racism analysis training very well. We've got really smart people who have been doing this for a long time, and we've had a level of success. So if you have some dollars to donate somewhere, I'm saying you can donate them at Roots of Justice. And here's one way to really piss off the people who are banning books. If books are being banned in your community, you could every time some books are banned, or every time somebody yells about banning books, or every time some legislation is passed about banning books, you actually can make a donation to an organization like this, or some other organization like the NAACP or something like that. Just make a big donation and make it known, make it public. If you're a business owner and you can afford to do it, when they're talking about banning books in your community or some LGBTQ issues or some racial stuff, make a donation to some organization, and that will piss them off. And that'll be great. And the organizations have an opportunity to grow. All right. So with that, I'm loving all of y'all. Bethany, thanks so much for tonight. You look great. That's the first time I've seen you all made up like that. You look real cute. Calenthia, you always look great. I love your hair. Nathan, nice haircut. That's a weak beard though. That's okay.
I think you better cut Conrad off right now. Bye, y'all.
All right. Love y'all. Peace.